What exactly happens to the human body when you strap it directly to an unshielded, completely unrestrained American muscle car engine, balance it on two narrow patches of rubber, and open the throttle wide enough to tear the air itself in half? Close your eyes and picture this scene. It is a suffocatingly hot summer afternoon in the early 1970s. The air at the local drag strip is thick, humid, and reeks of unburned high-octane fuel, melted rubber, and scorched ozone. You are standing in the dirt near the staging lanes, and the ground beneath your boots is literally vibrating. It is not shaking because of a passing train or a seismic event. It is shaking because, 50 yards away, a man is pushing a vehicle out of a rusted trailer that defies every single law of mechanical engineering, common sense, and basic self-preservation. This is the story of the deadliest motorcycle ever constructed on American soil. It is a narrative about a machine so violently overpowered, so inherently unstable, that its very existence was considered an insult to the professional racing establishment. But more than that, it is a psychological profile of the man who built it, rode it, and allowed it to quietly consume his entire life. When we talk about fast motorcycles today, we think of sleek, aerodynamic rockets built by teams of aerospace engineers in sterile wind tunnels. We think of carbon fiber, traction control, anti-lock brakes, and complex computer algorithms designed to save the rider from their own fatal mistakes. But this machine had absolutely none of that. It had no computers. It had no safety nets. It did not even have a traditional motorcycle frame. It was, quite literally, a massive Chevrolet Vate engine, the exact same heavy, cast-iron monster used to power 2-ton muscle cars, suspended between two wheels by a few pieces of steel tubing welded together in a dimly lit, drafty farm garage. The power-to-weight ratio was not just dangerous, it was mathematically suicidal. To ride it was to engage in a high-speed negotiation with death, and the man who built it never once blinked during those negotiations. To understand the true horror and the majestic insanity of this machine, you have to understand the era that birthed it. The 1960s and 70s were a time when the rules of motorsport were still being written in blood, broken bones, and shattered fiberglass. Drag racing was not the corporate, meticulously sanitized television spectacle that it is today. It was raw, it was chaotic, and it was deeply dangerous. Sanctioning bodies existed, but they were constantly trying to play catch-up with the sheer lunacy of the builders. Men were pushing the absolute limits of combustion, trying to find out exactly how much explosive force a piece of metal could contain before it became shrapnel. In the motorcycle classes, riders were tuning traditional twin-cylinder and four-cylinder engines to the absolute brink of destruction. They were shaving off every ounce of weight to gain a fraction of a second on the quarter mile. It was a game of precision, of delicate balances, of squeezing water from a stone. And then came a man from rural America who looked at all that delicate precision, laughed at it, and decided to solve the problem not with a scalpel, but with a sledgehammer. He realized that the only way to beat the fastest motorcycles in the world was to stop building a motorcycle altogether and start building a missile that just happened to have two wheels attached to it. But ask yourself this: why would a man with unparalleled mechanical genius choose to build something that every certified expert, every seasoned racer, and every law of physics said would kill him on the very first attempt? What drives a human being to look at a mathematically guaranteed death sentence and see only a puzzle waiting to be solved? The answer lies in the isolation and the unique mindset of the rural mechanic. Our builder was not an Ivy League engineer, he was a farm boy. He grew up in a world where things broke constantly, and if you could not fix them with the tools you had in your barn, you went hungry. Mechanical ability was not a hobby, it was a fundamental survival skill. When he looked at a motorcycle, he did not see a sacred object with strict design rules. He saw a machine that simply was not producing enough forward thrust. When he pitched the idea of dropping a small block Chevy Vate into a two-wheeled chassis, the racing community called him a lunatic. They told him the torque would snap the frame in half. They told him the heat from the exhaust headers would melt his legs. They told him the gyroscopic force of the massive internal car parts spinning at 7,000 revolutions per minute would make the bike impossible to steer, lean, or control. They told him that if he opened the throttle, the front wheel would lift, the bike would flip backward, and he would be crushed under 1,000 pounds of burning iron and gasoline. He listened to all of these warnings with a blank expression, nodded politely, went back to his unheated garage, picked up his welding torch, and started cutting steel. The engineering process behind this deadly machine was a masterclass in terrifying ingenuity. Because no parts existed for a Vate motorcycle, he had to invent them from scratch. He could not just buy a transmission that would fit, so he designed a custom chain drive system that bypassed standard gearboxes entirely. Think about what that means. He essentially built a direct drive system from a car engine to a motorcycle rear wheel. If that custom chain snapped under the immense pressure of a 400 horsepower launch, it would not just fall to the ground. It would act like a steel whip traveling at the speed of a bullet, capable of severing a man's leg completely in half before he even realized what had happened. He knew this. Every mechanic in the paddock knew this. But he simply designed a crude steel guard, bolted it over the chain, and considered the problem solved. To manage the unbelievable friction, he had to design a custom clutch using elements from a heavy-duty drum brake system. It was crude, it was heavy, and it was terrifyingly unpredictable. The rear tire was a constant point of failure. Motorcycle tires of that era were designed to handle maybe 50 or 60 horsepower on a good day. He was about to dump nearly 400 horsepower into a single patch of rubber no larger than the palm of your hand. He accepted the fact that the tire would simply vaporize into white smoke for the first half of the track. But the most dangerous aspect of the build, the true reason this machine was considered a deadly widowmaker, was the torque twist. In a car, when a longitudinally mounted Vate engine revs, the rotational force of the heavy internal crank makes the entire engine block want to twist in the opposite direction. A car has 4 wheels and a heavy chassis to absorb this violent twisting motion. A motorcycle has 2 wheels and a delicate center of gravity. If you revved this engine while sitting still, the entire motorcycle would try to violently lay down on its right side. If you were not physically strong enough to wrestle it upright, it would crush you before you even crossed the starting line. If you were sitting on a ticking bomb, feeling the unbearable heat of custom exhaust headers literally blistering the bare skin of your calves through your leather suit, what would be going through your mind in the 3 agonizing seconds before the green light drops? Would you pray? Would you panic? Would your heart rate spike so high that your vision blurs? For this man, the answer was none of the above. People who watched him prepare for a run noted that his resting heart rate seemed to drop. He looked less like a daredevil about to risk his life and more like a bored commuter waiting for a traffic light to change. He would straddle the beast, kick the starter, and the sound that erupted from the unbaffled exhaust pipes was not a roar. It was a physical shockwave. It felt like standing next to a falling building. The ground shook so violently that dirt would dance on the asphalt. The crowd would instantly fall silent, overpowered by the mechanical violence echoing off the grandstands. When the light flashed green, he did not smoothly roll onto the throttle like a normal racer. He dumped the crude clutch and unleashed hell. The rear tire would instantly spin at 100 miles per hour while the bike was barely moving, creating a blinding cloud of toxic white smoke. The front wheel would hover 2 feet off the ground, the engine screaming at the absolute limit of its structural integrity. For 10 terrifying seconds, he was not riding the motorcycle. He was barely surviving it. He was wrestling a wild, thrashing iron beast down a narrow strip of asphalt, fighting the torque twist with pure upper body strength, balancing on a rear tire that was actively melting away underneath him. He routinely crossed the finish line at speeds approaching 200 miles per hour. He did this wearing nothing but a rudimentary leather suit and an open-face helmet. But the physical toll of commanding the deadliest motorcycle in America was immense, and it is a cost that the highlight reels never show you. You cannot subject the human skeleton to that level of violent vibration, extreme G-forces, and brutal mechanical shock without paying a massive physiological price. The handlebars of his machine transferred the chaotic, unbalanced rhythm of a racing Vate directly into his hands, up his arms, and into his spine. His hearing was permanently damaged by the concussive blasts of the exhaust, which exited the engine block completely unbaffled just inches from his knees. The smell of burning clutch material and vaporizing rubber was permanently ingrained into his racing suit, serving as a lingering olfactory reminder of the chaos he commanded. When he finally climbed off the bike at the end of a long exhibition weekend, his muscles would be locked in a state of tetany, twitching involuntarily from the sheer physical trauma of holding onto a machine that actively wanted to kill him. After a weekend of racing, his hands would be cramped into rigid claws. Yet, he never once complained. He never asked for sympathy. He became a nationwide sensation. He was the undisputed king of the exhibition circuit. People who had absolutely no interest in professional drag racing would travel hundreds of miles just to see the madman and his deadly machine. He was drawing larger crowds than the official factory-sponsored championship races. Promoters threw money at him because they knew that wherever he showed up, the grandstands would be packed so tightly that people would be standing on the roofs of their own cars just to catch a glimpse of the smoke. He was living a mechanical dream, proving every educated engineer in the country wrong, and doing it entirely on his own terms. He had achieved a level of raw, unfiltered outlaw fame that most men can only fantasize about. So after surviving the impossible, after cheating the Grim Reaper week after week in front of screaming, adoring crowds, how does a gladiator of this magnitude actually meet his end? Does the engine finally explode and take him with it? Does the rear tire completely shred at 200 miles per hour, sending him cartwheeling into the concrete barriers? Does the deadly machine finally live up to its terrifying reputation? This is where the story takes a turn that is far more heartbreaking than any fiery crash. He was not destroyed by the machine. He was destroyed by the quiet, relentless march of time, and a world that simply stopped caring. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the culture of motorsport underwent a massive, sterile transformation. Drag racing became heavily professionalized. Major corporate sponsors moved in, bringing millions of dollars, TV contracts, and strict, uncompromising rulebooks. The Wild West era of exhibition racing was aggressively phased out. The governing bodies did not want a rogue farm boy on a homemade death trap stealing the spotlight from their polished, sponsored athletes. They wanted predictable categories, engineered safety standards, and marketable champions. Exhibition acts were suddenly viewed as a liability, a dangerous sideshow that distracted from the official program. The phone calls from promoters began to slow down. The massive guaranteed payouts shrank to a trickle. The world was moving on. Imagine possessing a totally unique, world-class talent. A talent that you forged in the fires of extreme danger, only to wake up one day and realize the world has simply changed the channel. He kept building, of course. He retreated to his garage and made the machines even faster, even more terrifying, even more mechanically flawless. He solved engineering problems that top-tier factory teams struggled with, but he was doing it in a vacuum. The massive stadiums of 50,000 screaming fans who used to stand up in absolute awe the moment his engine fired to life were slowly replaced by dusty county fairs, small-town car shows, and remote airstrips where the audience numbered in the hundreds. People would eat their popcorn and look at the massive Vate motorcycle parked in a makeshift pit area and see a novelty, a weird relic of a bygone era. They did not understand that the quiet, grease-stained man sitting in a folding chair next to the trailer had single-handedly conquered the most aggressive physics known to motorsport. It is a very specific, hollow kind of tragedy to be the absolute best in the entire world at a sport that the world no longer recognizes. The physical pain in his joints worsened, a lingering reminder of the violent days of glory. But the emotional isolation was far heavier. He had built the most dangerous, awe-inspiring vehicle of a generation, but there was no longer a stage large enough to hold it. What is truly remarkable, however, and what cements this man as a genuine legend rather than just a forgotten daredevil, is how he reacted to the fade. He did not grow bitter. He did not curse the corporate racing world for abandoning him. He simply went back to the garage, picked up his tools, and kept tinkering. Because the profound truth about the man who built the deadliest motorcycle in America is that he never actually needed the applause in the first place. The massive crowds, the magazine covers, the breathless track announcers, all of that was just a byproduct of his true obsession. The real joy, the actual purpose of his existence, was the problem-solving. It was the smell of the welding gas, the precise mathematical calculation of a gear ratio, the deep, satisfying rumble of a perfectly tuned engine breathing fire into the cool night air. Whether 50,000 people were watching him risk his life, or 0 people were watching him, his internal drive remained exactly the same. He was a man completely at peace inside his own obsession. He proved that true greatness is not measured by the volume of the crowd or the size of a corporate sponsorship, but by the quiet, unrelenting dedication to pushing a machine past the limits of what is considered possible. Eventually, history caught up with him again. Decades later, a new generation of gearheads, historians, and purists began to look back at the golden era of unhinged motorsport, and they rediscovered the legend of the Vate motorcycle. The machines that had been gathering dust were suddenly recognized as priceless artifacts of American ingenuity. He was interviewed, celebrated retroactively, and validated by a culture that finally understood exactly what he had accomplished without the aid of a single computer or wind tunnel. But by then, his body had paid the ultimate price for his genius. The years of wrestling a 1,000-pound mechanical beast at 200 miles per hour had broken down his physical frame, leaving him battered but entirely unregretful. When he finally passed away, he left behind a legacy that cannot be replicated in the modern era. We will never again see a time when a solitary individual with a torch, a pile of salvaged car parts, and an absolute absence of fear can show up at a professional racetrack and publicly humiliate the greatest factory teams on Earth. The deadliest motorcycle in America was exactly that: deadly, terrifying, and fundamentally unreasonable. But it was also a masterpiece of human defiance. It stands as a permanent reminder that sometimes the only way to find out what is truly possible is to ignore every single person who tells you that you are going to fail. Strap yourself directly to the engine of a muscle car, dump the clutch, and hold on for dear life. So the next time you see a modern, perfectly engineered superbike rolling quietly down the street, take a moment to remember the era of the sledgehammer, the era of the smoke, and the man who looked at the boundary between life and death and decided to cross it at 200 miles per hour, just to see if he could.